Okay, let's get started. After a little more logistics and recapitulations, what I want to talk about this lecture is accounting for the fact that the world is right now so divergent in its relative levels of economic development. I don't think we know all the answers. I don't think I'll provide a satisfactory lecture, but why it is that our world today is so small in the sense of transportation and communications, and yet is so divergent in terms of its extremes of wealth and poverty, is extremely important and I think extremely interesting. After all, to get, say, from, what's the furthest large city in the world from here? I guess it's probably Perth. To get from San Francisco to Perth, Australia, takes less time and costs less as a share of average people's incomes than it took to get from London to Edinburgh, from the capital of England to the capital of Scotland back in 1800. And that is one small island in northwest Europe was larger in terms of transportation and communications than our entire world is today. And yet if you looked across the regions of Great Britain in 1800, you saw they were pretty much all more or less the same. Some were a little bit richer than others, some poorer. Home counties of England were maybe 40% richer than average. Northern wastes of Scotland were maybe 40% poorer than average, but nothing like the extraordinary differences in living standards and productivity levels across regions that we see in our world today. That's the problem we're going to be gnawing at for most of this lecture. But first, logistics. Last I looked, we had 9 available seats and 9 people left on the waiting list, which means there's something hanging up your registration if you're on the waiting list. It's probably that you're trying to get into a section that is already full. But if it's something else, you need to go see Joan Cask at the International and Area Studies Office. She controls adding people to the class at this late date. But first of all, let's see how many of you there are who are still on the wait list and still want to get into this class. How many people are we talking about? Okay, 2 drops and 3 on the wait list. You're getting to Joan Cask. The wait list is cleared. We don't have a capacity problem in this class this way, and that's good. Now, there also was a request that I redo the additional office hours head-to-head competition with just the 2 times that were most popular, Tuesday after lecture and Thursday after lecture, in order to hope or in the expectation or in the belief or in the fear that people's preferences for additional office hours in addition to Wednesday afternoon would be different if they were just given the 2 most popular times, rather than if there were a bunch of others added to it as well. So what do people think? When do people want to have the additional office hours? Okay, Tuesday PM has a big significant plus. So there'll be Tuesday PM after lecture. I can't do it today because I've been dragged into the process of seeing whether or not the university wants to promote an assistant history professor to tenure, and so have to go running off to various meetings and read additional things. But starting next Tuesday, I'm going to go straight from lecture over to the Free Speech Movement Cafe patio and hang out there until everybody's questions are answered, and hopefully that will get more people coming to office hours in this course. In a way, it's odd that I'm doing this for the history department. As if I were the chancellor, I would say, look, Berkeley's finances have taken a huge hit over the past 3 years relative to our private university competitors. And also, we've been disappointed in the legislatures. The legislature has proven to be a lot less willing to continue to perform the function for Berkeley that the endowments perform for the private universities than we had thought it was, or indeed that the legislature had promised that it was. And so we're going to have a hard time attracting assistant professors in the next 10 or 15 years or so, the way we have over the past 10 or 15 years. That is, usually in the past, if someone has a choice between an assistant professorship at Berkeley and an assistant professorship at, say, Duke, they'll choose Berkeley. That's probably not going to be true over the next 10 years or so because Berkeley's long-run finances are shaky. In that case, we should be simply taking the assistant professors we got and promoting them as fast as possible because we're unlikely to be able to replace them with people who are as smart and as energetic and as creative quite as we currently have. So why not promote them and make them feel grateful to us? Maybe then they'll stay and they'll stick around and feel loyal when places like Duke or Northwestern or Yale come knocking and ask them to move. We're not doing that, and I don't understand why not. It's somewhat disturbing, but that's going to churn up my afternoon today. Also, logistics, problem set 2 is due at the start of lecture Thursday. In a big pile right up here at the front. Seems to be best. Problem set 3 will go out tomorrow, due on Thursday, February 10th at the beginning of the lecture. We're now working toward an early March first midterm exam. I'm not sure of the exact day yet because it depends on how quickly I get to go through the next bunch of the syllabus. So far, I'm pretty close to being on track, but that may change. Problem set 3 will be on mixed growth and depression economics. The stuff we've been talking about long-run growth since the beginning of the class. And then the next unit, the unit on why is it that we sometimes have periods of high unemployment like now, and how long are those periods likely to last? Last preliminary is recapitulations. Things you really should know if you take this course. Things I want drilled into your skull so that 5 years from now, if you're awakened from a sound sleep with a particular question, you'll be able to grab the right answer out of your brains. The first one was one that you all have nailed. That is, how much bigger is total world GDP now than it was 10,000 years ago? It's about 17,000 times bigger. Human populations are about 1,000, 1,200 times bigger than they were 10,000 years ago, and as a species, we're about 14 times as rich, to the extent you can make such calculations. That's a lot of economic growth, although it's over a long time. Most of it takes place at a relatively small pace. The thing I want you to have drilled into your skulls that we didn't all get right last time was what's the current unemployment rate? What fraction of the labor force, that is the people who have jobs and who say they're looking for jobs, do we have, not saying that they can't find a job, or at least can't find a job they would take? Yes, we're there. We have 97% giving the right seasonally adjusted answer, 9.4%, and the remaining 3% giving the seasonally unadjusted answer, 9.1%. If we don't specify, we want seasonally adjusted numbers, but that's good. Third, the question that belongs with the next unit. Back in 1803, Jean-Baptiste Say claimed that if there's deficient demand for some goods and services, there's excess demand for others, and so it's nonsensical to say that an economy is short of demand. This was something that confused economists for the first 30 years of the 19th century or so, from 1803 on up to 1829, I think. And alas, it still confuses people today. But we're nailing it. 98% getting the right answer B. because people spend their incomes not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets. Answer A explains why it is that a shortage of demand produces high unemployment, or one of the reasons why shortages of demand produce high unemployment. Because firms would rather fire people than cut everybody's wages. You cut everybody's wages, and it turns out that everybody feels dissed, substantially dissed. If they were being paid $12 an hour last year, but they're only paying you $10 an hour this year, you're not sure whether they did this because they had to, or whether they just think they might be able to squeeze a little more work out of you for less money. You're unhappy, you're not going to work too hard, you're going to slack off. Much better, almost every business in the world thinks, if you have to cut your wage bill, to cut it by firing a few people. Because then the people who are pissed are gone, and they aren't around to work badly. And the people who are still there are, A, they may be grateful for the fact that you kept them, and B, they may be scared that they're going to be next. So for worker morale, worker discipline, whatever issues, we see that wages are sticky downward, that businesses are very lax to cut wages, would rather fire workers instead, and that's why the number of firings in the economy went way, way up when demand fell off in 2008. Answer C is an explanation for B. There was a financial panic, and it disrupted the web of credit, and so as a result, a whole bunch of businesses and a whole bunch of people said, wait a minute, we need to have more financial assets, so we'll be able to make payments and fulfill our contracts if something else goes wrong. Answer D might be an explanation for some recessions we had in the 1970s when the world oil price tripled, and it might be the answer to an economic downturn that happens at some point in the future. It's not for today, and I forgot to put a letter E in front of the last. Overinvestment rendering important parts of the capital stock valueless. That certainly happened. We built way too many houses over the past 10 years in the desert between Los Angeles and Albuquerque for anyone to want to live in them. And most of the people who thought they'd be occupying those houses 4 or 5 years ago would rather have been living in 2 or 3 bedroom walk-ups in Venice Beach rather than God knows where, somewhere way beyond San Bernardino. But just because we've made a mistake and invested too much or in the wrong kind of capital doesn't mean the response ought to be or should be or must be high unemployment. We way overinvested in telecommunications in 1999 and 2000. The fallout from that didn't push the unemployment rate up to 10%. So I want answer B, and not C, D, or the thing that has no label that should be E. And last, what's the single equation you should use most often to analyze problems about long-run economic growth, at least in this course, and in follow-on courses that rely on this kind of growth model framework. This savings and investment and technology and population growth and efficiency of technology, efficiency of labor framework. And we're nailing this again. Yes, the first equation is the right one. For the second one, I flipped the numerator to the denominator in the initial fraction denoting the capital intensity of the economy. For the third one, I put the wrong little symbol up in the exponent. Equations D and E are absolutely fine equations, but generally you're usually going to want to be using A, because A gets at the fundamental determinants a little deeper than D or E do. And no, we already asked this. Let's skip this. But here's the last thing that I want nailed into your brain: your ability to do these kinds of growth calculations. So how fast did real GDP per capita in Botswana grow between 1960 and 2010? How do I expect you to do this calculation? And okay, and we're all the way up to 121. Okay, C, that's right. C is the answer I'm looking for. We don't yet have this nailed. The way to do this quickly in your head is to say that from 900 per year to 15,000 per year, that's much closer to multiplication by a factor of 16 than it is to multiplication by 8 or by 32. A factor of 8 is 3 doublings. A factor of 32 is 5 doublings. Multiplication by a factor of 16 is 4 doublings. 4 doublings over 50 years means 1 doubling is accomplished about every 12 years. And then you should use the rule of 72 to divide 72 by 12 and say that if something doubles in 12 years, it's growing at 6% per year. And that will give you 5.6% as the answer we are looking for. And last question. How far are you all coming from? It would be really nice to be able to start this lecture at 10 after on the spot, or even 8 after. And I had hopes of being able to do this because we're down here in the more or less the center of campus now, as opposed to way up in the engineering school or up in the business school or someplace else up where the air is thin because the altitude is high. And yet that doesn't seem to be what's happening. So where are people coming from? Ooh, yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to have to start between 12 and 15 because we got too many people coming from far, far away. The campus is just a little bit too spread out. I'll recommend to the chancellor that he build some more big honking 10-story buildings with classrooms in them rather than the 4- and 5-story buildings that seem to be the rule around here. That's too bad, but that's life, that's necessity. So with those preliminaries out of the way, we finally get to the meat of the lecture. Why is the world today so divergent? And the world wasn't always so divergent. Even 2 centuries ago, the world was much, much closer together if you looked across regions in terms of productivity levels and living standards than it is today. Come April, we're going to be bringing Professor Ken Pomeranz up from the University of California at Irvine, he being one of the world's experts on Chinese economic history and Chinese economic growth. And one thing he's likely to talk about is about how the general belief you find in America and in Northwest Europe that Western Europe, at least, has been richer than Asia for a very long time. Now that simply isn't true, and how the dividing line isn't 1,000 or 1,500, but that even in 1,800, there is very, very little to choose from in average people's living standards between, say, the home counties of England, the lower Thames Valley, the richest part of England, and the richest parts of China, the lower Yangtze Valley. England has an edge in precision machinery and the ability to get cheap coal to burn in your fireplaces to keep warm, but down in the Yangtze Delta, you really don't need to burn much coal in your fireplaces to keep warm. They don't have much precision machinery. They have much better textiles, significantly better paintings, and probably a more nourishing diet than England, because the English diet appears to take a big dive downward sometime in the 18th century. And if you look at England in 1800 versus the Stone Age, you see that standards of living in England in 1800, they have little, if anything, above the Stone Age. So what that tells us is that countries couldn't have been much poorer than they ever were before 1800 ever. then you couldn't have had the kinds of economic growth we've been having since 1800 and 1870, that it has to have started around 1800. Because if it had started earlier, it means people in 1700 would have been significantly poorer than people in 1800, and then all the people in 1700 would have starved to death. Significantly less than 2,300 calories a day for a population doing agricultural labor simply won't cut it. People simply won't survive to reproduce. So that back before 1800, it looks as though the world as a whole was pretty much as poor as it could be. That people were very close to what Thomas Robert Malthus would call biological subsistence. And the world was pretty equal as well. Maybe a spread of 4 or 5 to 1 at most between the richest and the poorest regions in the world economy. Pick 2 countries or 2 regions more or less at random, and the odds are overwhelmingly that the poor one will be at least half as well off as the rich one in terms of the average standard of living of its people. Differences across countries, especially if you take Great Britain and the Netherlands. Great Britain and the Netherlands being these 2 points way out here. The most commercial societies and the most energy-intensive societies the world back then had ever seen, with the United States bringing up the rear, in large part because of its extraordinary amount of arable land per capita. You see, when the Europeans hit the beaches of the Americas starting in 1492, they brought with them an incredible array of diseases that had been developed in Eurasia over the previous 10,000 years, since the Amerindian population had immigrated over the Bering Strait. And so by the time European settlement started on a significant scale in North America, Amerindian populations were down by 80%, 90% relative to their previous peaks. Which is why most of the narrative of the United States is of expansion into a largely unoccupied wilderness. But the wilderness had not long been unoccupied. It was simply this disease-born demographic catastrophe that had created the United States, in which people had immense farms by European standards and were thus relatively wealthy. But the world in 1800, nevertheless, was pretty equal, even though it was very large. Right? 6 months to go from Britain to India in 1800, which made the British conquest of India a kind of unusual thing, because the people in London were always giving orders that were at least a year out of date by the time they got back to India. Our world today is much more unequal, in spite of the fact that it has shrunk enormously in transportation and communications. But before we get to that, we should first deal with the question of why in the world of 1800 was it so equal? And how do we know that modern economic growth could not have been going on long before 1800? What makes us confident with our declaration that our current era, in which each generation is highly likely to see increasing technology and increasing living standards, has not been going on for very long in historical perspective? Why do we know that back before 1800, the idea that people should live better than their parents was a weird and unusual idea, rather than what it is today, a commonplace? And we're spread out all over the place. I favor D, possibly not with intelligent raccoons. But in any event, D is, I think, the right answer. We know this because we have a pretty good read on what standards of living were in 1800, and if they had grown at anything like the doubling every 50 years of the 19th century, or the doubling of standards of living every 30 years of the 20th century, people even back in 1700 would overwhelmingly have been dead of starvation. The other answers. Well, C is the economist's traditional explanation of why there was no modern economic growth back before 1800. That you didn't have modern governments and modern markets up and running in such a way that people thought that they could turn their attention to figuring out how to make whatever they were making more cheaply and on a larger scale. Instead, once people got somewhat rich, they began to think, how am I going to be able to keep what I have against someone from the government coming and grabbing it from me? Answer B is the answer you tend to get if you go to the engineering school. Right? Well, of course, you can't get rich until you can make really cool machines. And it was key developments in metalworking in the late 18th century and the late 1700s that created the space for the Industrial Revolution and for modern economic growth. Oxford economic historian Robert Allen has a very nice book about how all this came together. How the fact that England had cut down all its trees and so had to rely on coal for energy, and how agricultural productivity was fairly high, so wages were high and energy was abundant, as opposed to China, which at the time was about as rich, but where wages were low and energy was really expensive. How that gave England an edge in terms of giving its engineers an incentive to develop very good high-precision machinery so they could actually use coal and steam power to do stuff, and how then that took it off. The economists tend to be more social sciences and less engineers because we tend to go for C rather than for B. And A tends to be much more ecologists and demographers and others, who tend to say, well, of course, back when you only have 5 million people on the earth and none of them can read, well, of course, it's very hard to have the kind of scientific knowledge, scientific progress, and technological application in order to make for modern economic growth. Right? That back before the year 1500, it took 400 years for the idea of spaghetti to get from China to Italy, for example. Well, it takes 400 years for an invention like that to diffuse across Eurasia, as opposed to today, when someone gets on a plane with a blueprint, and they were in Frankfurt in the morning, they're in Seoul in the afternoon, or the following morning, as opposed to today. Of course, you get a lot more progress today than you did in the past. After all, 2 heads are better than 1. Or as the computer scientists like to say, if you have enough eyeballs looking at them, all bugs are shallow. Right? All problems are easy to solve if you have enough independent minds trying to think of how to solve them. By contrast, when you don't have a lot of people and when they aren't literate and you can't write things down, it's very hard to have rapid technological progress. Since I'm an economist, I'm going to tend to slide to answer C when asked how do we know that modern economic growth wasn't going on long before 1800. I have no reason to think that's correct. Surely if I were a demographer, I would think A, and surely if I were an engineer, I would think B. The answer to this particular question, however, is D. We know, because of the poverty of the world in 1800, that modern economic growth had not been going on for long. For why it hadn't been going on for long, those are the other possible answers. They're the answers to a slightly different question. Well, we can take a more quantitative, not just why was the world in 1800 so poor, why was the world in 1800 remarkably equal?